Okay, so in looking at this, you can sort of see I probably still need to move her foot around a little bit just to sort of get some idea of where I think she really needs to be anchored onto this. It's possible that she could be where she is. Again, one of the things that I like to do in compositing, again, you won't see this on the video, but you will see it, you'll hear it at least, so hopefully this will remind it. So, this is the scene. Everybody turn around in here and look at me. So you've shot a picture of this. This is your location, this wall with the boards on it and all that kind of stuff. That's it. And you shot a picture of me in the studio and you've dropped me into the studio just like this. What anchors me into this picture? Well, you can try and do, shadows are the number one things that anchor people in, so we'll talk about building shadows, we'll get to that today, whatever. But one of the things, and I look for these all the time if I can possibly do it, if there's any way that you can come up with something that's actually in the scene, in the background that you're shooting, and have it overlap me, it puts me in the scene, it forces me into the scene. So what do I mean by that? Well, you could drop me in just like this. There's nothing that's in this scene that's overlapping me, but if I take this and I bring this forward like this and I do this, this was in my scene. You've added me, but part of this now is overlapping part of me. This anchors me into that scene. Does that make sense? So, and I look for anything. You look for, so for instance, she's standing on leaves. If I can get some leaves to come up over the tops of her shoes or even just up on the sides of her shoes, it's elements that are in the image that all of a sudden, instead of her being on the front of everything, there's elements that are in the image that are now on top of her, and that forces her into that scene. And the smallest, most subtle things actually do that, and it's just something for you guys to be aware of. Are we good on this part? All right. So we'll deal with the shadows in her feet and that kind of stuff a little bit later. If you take a look how I really shot this girl, how I imagined it to be, her foot was actually, this back heel was just on the back side of that rock. So I'm going to select this comp 2, hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm simply going to move her up slightly so that she's sort of on that top edge. Yep, just kind of like that part right there. She's on this top edge right here. So again, it's a subtle thing, but it's an important thing. So that's how I'm going to start with all of this. However, when you look at this, there are problems that we have on this. So what I have got is I do have color is okay. My lighting direction is okay. My exposure is okay. But I've got other things that are problematic in this. Contrast is one of them. She is way too contrasty to be in this scene. Even though I did my best when I was shooting it in the studio, she's too contrasty for this scene. So I have options. I can either boost the contrast of the background or I can lessen the contrast of her. We will look at how to do that and the best way of doing that in a minute. But I've got other things to deal with. I'm not entirely convinced, even though the color is both neutral on both of these. I'm very close in my color, but we have, when you look at this scene, when you look at the woods and that kind of stuff, it tends to be dominated by these sort of yellows and browns and oranges. Not oranges, yellows, brown, yeah, there's some oranges, but those colors really tend to dominate this. And so even though my color in that scene is neutral, that doesn't mean that they actually perfectly match. So we're going to look at ways to actually figure all of this out. And then finally, in color, I'm not only dealing with color, but I've got to deal with saturation as well. So we're going to deal with all of those things. And the way you do it is check layers. So anybody, I am taking you right now so far beyond what most compositors in the real world even have heard of or know. So hang on, the ride's going to get a little bumpy. But again, my job is to make each and every one of you employable for some serious cash at the end of all of this, not for minimum wage. And it's this kind of shit that makes the difference. Okay, so we are going to use check layers. The first thing we need to do is load them. I've already built them for you. Again, they're always the same. So I am getting a little ahead of myself. If you want to know how to really build a set of check layers, there's a PDF that I've included for you. So if we take a look in our session number 9, it's right here. There's a thing called check layers set.atn. That's actually a pre-made set of Photoshop actions that you're going to load. But if you want to know how to actually build them, click on, there's a PDF in here. This is actually how they're built. So you'll see the first one is a luminosity check layer. This tells you how to build that. Then there's a saturation check layer. This tells you how to build that. And finally, there is a color check layer, and this tells you how to build that. And then it'll go through all sorts of explanations about why we build them, the way we build them, and do all of that kind of stuff. This is really time consuming. This will take up the entire rest of our class, and I want you guys to actually have these things and work with them as opposed to reading how to build them. But you should understand what's going on behind the scenes, so this is here for you. Are we good on this part? Okay. So to use the check layers, first you need to load them into Photoshop. So to do that, back in Photoshop, we need to go to our Actions palette. So click on the Actions palette. Then again, the menu item that's just to the right of that, the 3 or 4 lines, whatever that is, click on that. You'll get a drop-down menu, and you want to come down to the middle part where it says Load Actions. Click on that. It'll open up a dialog box, and then you need to navigate to our session number 9 folder, because that's where the preset set of those actions, that's the ones that I built for you. So into class number 9 inside of your student folders, and you'll see it's this check layers set.atn. You want to click on that and then hit open. They will actually then populate they'll be in your actions. You can see I've got now a number of sets, but I've got this check layers set. Does everybody have that? Because if you don't have it, you're not going anywhere from this point on. Yeah, make sure I'm recording. All right, we're good? Okay, so to use this thing, make sure that you've got your top layer selected. So I've got the image of the girl, that's what is selected. Because if we had the background selected and we ran this, it would put all of these check layers between the figure and the background, and you don't want this. These are going to apply to the figure. So make sure that you've got the figure highlighted. Come over to the check layer set. You don't want to open it up. You want to grab the group, the whole folder. Actually, it's not letting you grab the whole folder, so I lied about that. Go ahead and open the folder up. And then where it says check layers at the very top, the parent of all of these layers right here, click on that to make it active. That will allow you to click on the arrow at the bottom of the actions palette that points to the right, and it will create all of your check layers. And you should end up with something that looks, again, almost solarized. Did that work for everyone? Anybody did it not happen on? Okay, if we take a look at what happened, if you go over to your layers palette, you will see that there is a folder up here called Check Layers. If you scroll down to the first one, you will see that there's only 2 of these eyeballs that are on. There is a hue saturation, and then there's also a color fill on here. And again, those are both in the group that is this color check layer. If you collapse the color check layer, you will see that you've only got a color check layer group, a saturation check layer, and a luminosity check layer. And the color check layer is the one that's on. And unfortunately, this is a part of how actions are built. I don't spend tons of time debugging my actions or doing that kind of stuff. It just is what it is. But as it turns out, this is the last thing that we want to run, is the color check layer. We are going to do the other 2 first. Or we're going to at least do the other one of them first. We may do color and then saturation. Typically when we work with check layers, you'll do something, and then as you do, they're interactive with each other. So when I change the color, it's going to change the saturation, and when I change, so it's kind of a back and forth process, but you'll see how this whole thing works. But for the time being, I want you to turn off the color check layer eyeball, and I want you to turn on the luminosity check layer eyeball and select it. So what happens is that it actually turns this image black and white. Now this is very different than doing a black and white adjustment layer on here, because doing black and white adjustment layers does not respect perceived tone. We see perceived tone in black and white different than Photoshop sees it underneath the hood. To show you what I'm really talking about, I want you to make a brand new layer for me really quickly. So just hit Command N to bring up a brand new layer. I'm going to change this to pixels, and I'm just going to do a 10 by 8 by 300 pixels. And I'm going to say OK to that. It's just going to build a temporary new file right here. I am going to use my rulers. I'm going to click on my ruler on the left, and I'm going to drag out. And as I start to get towards the middle, regardless of what increments, numbers you have in your ruler, it'll actually snap to the middle, so it'll give me my middle line. So now I've just divided my rulers, my image in half. I am going to select my foreground color. I'm going to change this to a pure blue. So to get to a pure blue, I'm going to do 0 red. Hit the tab key to go green, 0 green, hit the tab key and go to 255 blue, and say OK to that. This is a pure blue. Now I need to fill this left side with this pure blue, so I'm going to hit the M key to get the marquee tool. I'm going to click and drag down to start a selection, but remember, before you let go, don't let go, just click and hold down, keep the marching ants going, keep your mouse down. Hold down the space bar, it'll allow you to move this selection around, and you want to just goose it up till the marching ants are going in the top left-hand corner. Let go of the space bar and then just bring it all the way down to the bottom and all the way over to the line that you put in the very middle. And you can see I've now got marching ants on the middle part of this, and we're just going to fill it with foreground color. Option, or if you're on Windows Command, or no, it's Option as well. Option and the Delete or Backspace key, it fills it with blue. Everybody got this filled with blue? Okay. If we then go up to the Select menu and come down and do Inverse, it'll select the other half, the half that hasn't been filled with anything. I want a new background, a new foreground color here, so I'm going to click on the foreground color picker, and this time I'm actually going to create yellow. So to create yellow, click on the red value and type in 255 red, hit the tab key, 255 green, hit the tab key, 0 blue. That is yellow, and now say OK. And then again, I want to fill this now with my foreground color, which is yellow. So again, it is Option Delete, Command D to deselect. And we have now got a blue background and a blue color in here and a yellow color in here. Which of these is brighter? Say what? Do they look the same? No, but it is true. Both of these are the same. If we actually put, well, we can actually do it right here. Go ahead and just jump this. We need to make a copy of it because this layer is locked. Just hit Command J to make a copy of it. And then come up to your image menu, down to Adjustments, all the way down to Desaturate. And it will desaturate the color. And you can see, if you hit Command H, that there is no difference in those two. They have the exact same brightness. But we do not perceive brightness the same way. Visually, we see yellow as being lighter than blue. So if you've done all of this, hit Command Z to undo that. Go to your image, the composite that we're actually working on, and grab your luminosity check layer and drag that on top of this image that we just created. And let go. It's going to tell me something about it's 2 different color spaces. I don't care. I'm just going to hit OK, OK, OK. And now you can actually see that the brightness of these is very different. So what we are doing in our luminosity check layer is that we are getting rid of color, but we're also doing it in a way that has luminosity the way our eyes perceive luminosity. Does that make sense? All right, you can close up this file that we created. You don't need to save that. So What luminosity is designed to do is to actually allow us to look at this image without color and make decisions about this based on exposure, contrast. That's what we're really looking at here. And you can already see from this image in a really big way that the image is much more contrasty than the scene that I'm actually looking at. If you look at this scene, the blacks are nowhere near that dark. And if you imagine the girl actually out in the woods, if this was real, there would be all of this light coming from the sky around it, not just from the overhead part, but as it comes down, there's stuff that's bouncing up off the ground, there's light that's coming up off the ground. All of this would be lighter. So she's too contrasty to begin with, and I can tell here just by looking at it this way. So to fix that, my first move is to drop the contrast on this. How would you guys lower contrast? Well, most of you know this. Most of you know how to boost contrast. So I'm going to come down here to my composite for the body itself, and I'm going to add a curve on the bottom of this. So I've clicked on my composite. I'm going to then, because you need the adjustments that we need to make need to be underneath our check layers. If they're on top of our check layers, then our check layers are not doing their job. So the check layers are always going to remain at the very top of this. Everything that we do is now going to be just above the figure that we're actually working on. So to do this, I'm going to add a layer. So I'm going to click on the adjustment layer, and I'm going to add a curve to this. However, when we add this curve, we only want to impact the girl. We do not want to impact the background. So I need to clip this curve to the figure. We've done this before. We're going to do it again. Hover your cursor right between both the layers, between the curve and the composite, and hold down the Option key. Your cursor will change into a square with an arrow that points down. Click on it. You will see that the whole curve moves to the right, and that little arrow that was on that curve shows up. Now when I actually move, I'm going to just do a wild move with my curve. When I move my curve like this, you can see it only impacts the figure. It does not impact the background. That's because we have clipped it down. However, the other thing that I need to worry about in this is that when you change curves in RGB, you don't just affect tone, you also affect color. So we need to change the blending mode of this curve from normal down to luminosity so that it will only impact the tonal range, not the color of the image. Does that make sense to everyone? Are we good on this part? Do you guys get the reason that we did that blending mode? Is anybody unclear about why we did the blending mode to luminosity? I need to show you. You can unclip this layer, so go ahead and unclip the layer. Hover your cursor between, again, the curve that we're making right now and the figure. Hold down your Option key, and you will actually see you get that same figure, except now the arrow has got a slash through it. That's how you unclip this. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer. I'm going to reclip this image. I'm going to change the blending mode back to normal, and then I'm going to boost the contrast. Most of you know that putting an S-shaped curve on it will boost the contrast. So I'm going to click in the area of my 3/4 tones for my shadows. I'm going to click and pull this down. That makes my darks darker. And then I'm going to go up to my quarter tones that are up at the very top, and I'm going to click and I'm going to push this up. So I've created an S-shaped curve. It makes my shadows darker, my highlights lighter, and I end up with a more contrasty image. But look what happened to the color. That's a huge perversion of color. All of that red was a gain. Bree. Simply add a curve on top of that. Now we need to clip this down, so hover your cursor between the two, hold down the Option key and click, and then do an S-curve. Pull this down, not too far, and then come up here to the top and push it up. Perfect, not too much, not too much, not too crazy. Right there. Keep it kind of nice curve right here, and turn off your luminosity check layer, and you'll see what our problem is. So again, I brought in contrast, but this changed the color completely. This saturates the color. That's the number one thing it does. It perverts it, but it also saturates it. So if I then change the blend mode of this curve from normal down to luminosity, you will see that it picks up contrast, but the color goes back to the original color. I don't have that super saturated face. I don't have that super saturated. So this is why we use blending modes to restrict what we're trying to change. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. To get the curve back to its default, if you go up into the presets, you'll see the preset right now is saying custom because we just built a curve. It's a custom curve. But if you click on that drop down and go all the way up to the top, you can go to default and it will reset your curve. So it's just a good trick to know so that whenever you're doing this, if you've got stuff that's happening in all the channels, all that kind of stuff, it resets everything. So most people would say, well, okay, if you're doing that, then you simply do the reverse of that S-curve. We can actually click on the shadows down here at the bottom and lift them up instead of bringing them down. And then click on the highlights and instead of lifting them up, drag them down. So now what my S-shaped curve is doing is making my highlights darker and my shadows lighter. And if you think that this looks like a good contrast lessening move, I've got a bridge for you that I can sell you in Brooklyn or some land in South Florida that you would be happy to own, or this looks like shit. And there's no getting around it. This is not how you change contrast, reduce contrast. Doing a positive S-curve to increase contrast is okay. It's not my favorite. There's other ways I think you can do it, but certainly killing contrast, this is just awful. So then basically you just tell everybody you're a fine artist. You print this out really big because good art is really big. And you just say, I'm a fucking artist and this is my look. Kiss my ass. Of course, then you'll never get a gallery to represent you. Your job at Whole Foods will really sour after a while. You'll hate that life. You'll start drinking and doing way too many drugs and you'll be dead at 30. But everybody will know you as the artist who no, anyway. All right, so throw that curve away. We're not even going to use the curve to do this. To drop contrast, because we actually have a smart object, it's a beautiful thing because we're actually going to run a smart filter on this. Unfortunately, you would think that all the filters in Photoshop would actually be in the filter menu, but you would be wrong. Adobe, if you're listening, another fuck up on your part. To get to it, you need to go to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadow and highlights. Who would have thought that this is a filter? But look what happens. So if you bring this open, it will actually open up. When we say OK to this, it's actually going to add this as a smart filter onto our smart object, which is a beautiful thing. However, when it opens up right off the bat, it's opened up pretty much like that curve was before. It's incredibly light on this. When Photoshop, when you run shadows and highlights, what it does is if you don't see this big version of it like mine right here, you just need to click on the check mark down at the bottom where it says show more options. We don't use these adjustments on the lower part a lot. I pretty much only do this to control the shadows. But in the shadow part, it actually opens up by default always at this shadow setting. So the amount is always 35%, a tone of 50%, and a radius of 30 pixels. And then the highlights are always zeroed out. So this is not impacting my highlights at all. All this is doing is lifting my shadows. It's lifting it too much though. So I'm going to cancel this for a second because I need to turn on my luminosity check layer again so that I can see this happen in real time. So I'm going to click on my luminosity check layer, which makes my image essentially a grayscale. I've got my composite body number 2 selected. I'm going to come up to the image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. It's going to open this up, and now I need to set the slider for my shadow amount so that my scene matches, so that this image begins to match the scene that I've got going in my background. And it's strictly a visual thing. So I'm going to start dropping this down, and what I'm looking for is where do I get to the point where I really believe that this is how much fill she would be getting from the area that's actually surrounding this. And so I'm looking, and for me, it's roughly around this 10% area. Looks good to me right now. You can use your preview check mark to turn this on and off so you can sort of see the adjustment that's being made. Does she fit into this scene now? Does this feel better? I'm asking all of you. It does, right? So go ahead and say okay to this. You will notice now you have got a smart filter. It is a filter. It's sitting right down underneath our smart objects. You can actually double click on this and adjust it again. Because again, and if you save your file, close it up, open it up on another computer, this smart filter will be sitting there and it will be set to these settings and you can continue to work on your file here. So you don't lose anything in doing this. So I'm going to turn off of my check layer right now and say, does this fit my image better? And when I'm looking at it, I feel like, okay, it does. If you turn off the smart filter eyeball, if you turn off the shadows and the light highlight eyeball, depending on how powerful your computer is and depending on how big your image is, this can take a long time to render because you're re-rendering the file. The easier way to turn it on and off is to select the mask for your filter. So again, I've selected the smart filter mask. My little brackets are around that mask, and just invert it, Command-I. And Command-I makes it white or black. So you can just go back and forth really quick and say, does this fit? And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, yes, this does fit for me right now. Now I think my color and saturation are still off. So I'm going to work on those now because those can have an impact on my luminosity setting. Make sense? We good on this part? Okay. The next check layer that I'm going to go after is not saturation. It's going to be my color check layer. And so you click on the eyeball for the group because there's two layers in here. And the reason there's two layers in here is that if you open it up, if you uncheck the one on the top, the hue saturation one, this is the color of my image. However, it's really hard to see. This is like LAB color. It's extremely difficult to see what these colors are. When you look at this, I can pick out the greens and I can pick out some of the yellows. The girl looks like, I don't know, like a faded out blue cyan to me. We need to amp up the difference in these colors in order to help us build, to do the color balancing. So we simply turn on a hue saturation layer that's max saturation. This has got the saturation hit all the way to the side. And now I can see the difference in my images. My background is dominated in these warm yellows and oranges. And my image, the figure face is not bad, but the figure itself is horrible here. This is the mismatch that we can't pick out, even though these are both color balanced based on a color card. Yes? So turn off your luminosity check layer and you are there. So I need to do the color balance on these. I need them to be more harmonious. So to do that, come down to your image, select the body. We are now going to do a color balanced curve on top of this. To do it, come down to your adjustment layers at the bottom, click on the adjustment layer, and we are going to come up, and what we are looking for here is color balance. The very first thing you do is clip this color balance to the figure. We are only changing the color of the girl, not our whole scene. So hover over between the girl and the adjustment layer that we just put on there. Hover over right between the two. Hold down your Option key and click, and it will actually clip it down. You'll also notice, this is newer in Photoshop, it's been around for a few years. They have that same clipping icon sits right here at the bottom of your palette. So if you look at the bottom of your properties palette at the very bottom, you can actually do this clipping on and off down at the very bottom, and you'll see it does the exact same thing. The trick where you're holding the Option key between the two has been around forever in Photoshop. This addition of it up here has been added later on. However, the next thing you do, and this is critical, is that you've got to change the blending mode of this color correction curve from normal down to color, because we do not want this thing to impact anything except for the color. Are we good on that part? Okay, so then looking at this image, I say to myself, okay, well, I need to change the girl so she fits the background. The girl is too blue. She needs to be less blue. Well, look at your color corrections. You've got 3 possible curves, 3 possible adjustments in this curve that you can move. You've got a slider that is your yellow-blue scale. You've got another one that's your green-magenta scale, and another one that is your red-cyan scale. I'm going to start here using the slider in the blue-yellow range, and I'm going to simply click on that slider and start pushing it towards the yellow range, and I've already started to get it closer. I've got elements in this image right now that have this same sort of like yellow coloring in it. The girl has still got a lot of green in her that this background doesn't necessarily have. So before I go too far, I'm actually going to grab my magenta green slider and I'm going to start to push it slightly towards the magenta. And you can see that it starts to get into some of this color is beginning to blend in with what's going on. I think my yellow needs a little bit slightly more adjustment in there. Possibly. Yeah, and now this is beginning, she is beginning to sort of meld into the background, don't you think? Right? So even though I have no idea what this coloring is, this is how you actually use a check layer to actually get your color to be set. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on? So to see if this works, we now need to turn the eyeball on your color layer off. And then come down to your color adjustment layer and turn it on and off and see if it does match. And again, it's perfect. It actually put in that slight touch. It's almost a brownish that it puts in. But look at the way her coat matches the coloring of the scene that we're actually in right now. Again, try to do that without a check layer. You would hate your life. Does this make sense to everyone? All right, so my final one in here that we haven't hit yet is the luminosity check layer. So I'm going to turn it on. And what you have in a luminosity check layer here is that so what you're seeing here is it's a reflection of saturation. So anywhere in the image that is light is highly saturated. Anywhere in the image that is dark is desaturated. Saturation. Again, I've already done luminosity. Okay. I've already done color. Now I'm doing saturation. Okay. Right? We good? So again, to explain what you're seeing here is that any part of the image that is highly saturated is light. Anything that is desaturated is dark. So you can see that the coat shows up so dark because it's got no color in it. It's a black coat or really dark brownish coat, brownish black coat, whatever. It's got nothing in it, right? But her face has got color in it. So looking at her face, I'm trying to figure out, does that match the scene that we've actually got going on in here? And for me, I feel like it's probably pretty close. I feel like it might actually use a slight boost in saturation. But again, I'm just trying to get this so that it feels like this fits into this space. So if I feel like the saturation needs an adjustment, and I'm really not sure that it does, we'll see here in just a second. Come back. We are now going to add the saturation layer above our color balance layer. So you can do it underneath it. It doesn't matter, but you need to clip it to, again, the girl. So I'm simply going to select my color adjustment layer. I need to then add an adjustment layer above this that will impact saturation. So I'm going to click on adjustment layers and I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer. It comes up onto the top of that. I need to clip this layer to the color layer, which is clipped to the figure. So again, hover my cursor between the two layers, the color adjustment layer and the hue sat layer, hold down the Option key and click. It will then clip it to only affect my figure now, but I also need to change the blending mode of this hue saturation layer from normal all the way down to down to saturation. So this will not pervert my color, it will simply impact the saturation. And then, like I say, from my point of view, I feel like her face is a little bit darker, which would indicate it's less saturated than the background. So that means I need a boost in saturation. So I'm going to grab my saturation slider and start pushing it to the right to boost it up a little bit. And you can see it's sort of getting it a little bit lighter, just a touch. I'm at a +10 for my saturation. I'm on the fence about whether this is going to work or not, but we will find out right now. I'm going to turn off the visibility of my hue saturation check layer and then come down to my hue saturation and turn it on and off. And you can see that slight boost of saturation took some of the paleness out of her skin, some of the desaturated part of her skin, and in my opinion, it actually fits this scene better than we had before. To find out what the difference is really for all the work that we just did, come back to your history panel, click on the history panel. We are going to do a snapshot of our history, so click on snapshot and we'll just call this adjusted and say OK to that, and then turn off your hue saturation adjustment layer, your color adjustment layer, and the eyeball on your saturation for your shadows and highlights, and do another snapshot of this and call it unadjusted. I turned off all the adjustments. And now you've got two history states that you can go back and forth between really fast. So you can't turn off all your adjustments really quick, but you can do back and forth between these. And look at the difference. So what you thought might have been a good composite, look at how this thing sets into my background right now. This is insane.
When you were doing the saturation slider, what are you looking for when you have that layer up?
Well, the only thing that's got really saturation in the figure at all is her face.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to match her face, and we can go back and take a look at it really quickly because I've got them, all of them are on right now. Turn the saturation back on again, and what I'm really looking for is her face relative to, you know, all of the background leaves and this kind of stuff, not really the rocks. I'm feeling like this was, again, if I turn off my saturation layer, you can see it's a really subtle move, but it's just lightening it up a little bit. And if I opened it up and took a look at it and said, no, I hate that, it's a very subtle adjustment. It only was 10 points. So, yeah. Yes?
So, since we have the active Photoshop now, can you apply that to
Any of them. You do this for every composite for the rest of your life. That's why I do it.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't ever have to build this again. It does exactly what it's meant to do. All right, are there questions about any of this? Are we feeling good about this so far? Okay, time to gild the lily. You can turn off your saturation check layer. I'm feeling pretty good about this part right here. And again, at this stage of the game, I would more than likely go back and turn on my luminosity check layer again and revisit this. Am I okay with the contrast? Do I feel like the contrast part of here is okay? Do I like that part of it? You know, am I feeling somewhat good about this? And I could say yes. If I felt like the one thing that I'm feeling like right here possibly is that the area that's right in here where the buttons are is still a little bit dark for the way I would feel this thing to really be. It seems a little bit dark to me. So I can actually fix that. Again, this is an exposure issue for me right here. That's the way I feel about this guy. So I'm just going to show you a quick trick that I would use for this. I'm going to leave my luminosity check layer on. I'm going to select my hue saturation layer. It's the last thing, the adjustment layer that I did, because I need to add another adjustment layer on here to open up that area that's really the sort of like, you know, again, it's right below her boobs, right above her waist. That area right in there, I just need to lift it a little bit. So I'm going to add just a regular curve for this. So again, we're going to select adjustment layers, and I'm going to add just a regular curve. I am going to clip it because I only want it to impact the image, so I'm holding down the Option key and click between the layers, so it's going to clip it to the hue saturation layer, which is clipped to the color balance layer, which is clipped to the image, so they're all clipped to the image. I'm then going to change the blending mode of this, and I'm not going to do luminosity. Some people would say it's luminosity, but what I really want to do is lift those the tones that are down there in her shirt. We'll go ahead and do it with luminosity because using blend modes matters here. So I'm going to click on my blending mode and change it from normal all the way down to luminosity because I just want to change the tone. And then I'm going to grab my black point at so again, on the curve at the very lower left-hand corner, that's where my black point is. I'm going to click on this and I'm just going to lift it up. And I'm going to lift it up quite a bit. So you can see it really washes out the image. Don't worry about that part. It's doing what I need it to do. And I can go back in and readjust this later if I need to. So it just lifted everything in the blacks for this girl. Then I'm going to make this mask on that curve black because I want to hide that. So I'm just going to hit Command I to make it black. And then I am going to go to my tablet. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to turn my tablet on. I'm going to make it a soft brush, completely soft brush. I'm going to then make white my foreground color because again I'm going to paint on this layer mask to open this area up. I'm going to zoom in on this just a little bit. I'm going to then change the flow of my brush way down. I'm going to take it down to like 2, 3, 4%, somewhere in there. I'm going to then use the size of my brush to get it a little bit larger because again I want to open up just this area that's sort of in here. So I'm working with a very slow flow. So this allows me to scrub in this area back and forth to slowly lighten that area up. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to start running in this area till I feel like it's actually opened up. That feels pretty good to me. I'm going to do a little bit on this other side over here to open that up. I'm going to do a little bit on her arms to open that up. That may be a little too much on her arms, but I can push that back down later on. And I'm feeling pretty good about this. This actually looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to turn my luminosity check layer off. And this is what that curve just did. It just lifted those shadows up a little bit, which again causes this to match my scene the way I imagine the light in this scene to actually be. Does this make sense to everyone? Did that work for everyone? Yeah. I know right now your head's probably spinning, but I'm telling you, you guys are heading for the promised land. Okay, last thing to do to make this complete is I need to anchor her in this space. She's not anchored into this space. To do that, we need shadows. We need to put her, again, her body would be creating shadows, and it's the part that's missing the most. So I'm going to show you how to do shadows today. We're going to do very simple shadows today. We're going to do extremely complex shadows next week. But we're going to start out with the easiest ones to do. So when you do your shadow work, the place that you want to do, and please listen up. Again, write this down, put this in your phone, whatever. Your shadows always go on top of your background, but underneath your figure. And the reason that happens is this. I'm going to actually click on my tree layer. You can do this with me. I'm going to add a blank layer on top of this. And when I add a blank layer on the top of this, this is what I'm going to rename it Shadows. So I'm double clicking on it and call it Shadows. And say, okay, I'm going to hand paint these shadows. This is not how you're ultimately going to do this, but some people are really good at this. Some people can hand paint shadows. I'm not one of them. So I'm going to show you, it's just a quick down and dirty way because I want to show you what's really involved with this, but nonetheless. I'm going to hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. If black is not your foreground color, hit the X key to make it your foreground color. I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to make it a very soft brush because shadow edges are very soft. I'm going to bring my flow all the way back up to 100%. Opacity up at 100%, and I'm just going to come in, zoom in under her foot right here, and I'm just going to paint just black underneath it here like this. And you can see when I do that, that because I'm on top of the background, it actually darkens the background, which is how a shadow would actually be, but it doesn't cover her boot. It stays underneath her boot. If, on the other hand, I lift my shadows all the way up to the very top, I'm going to take them all the way up to the very top above my check layers. It didn't go, so let me try that again. I'm going to take it above my check layer so it's at the very top. Son of a... I'm just taking it above the girl. So I'm going to go up above just my adjustment layers because apparently I'm having trouble getting between my check layers. So now my shadow's on top and you can see it covers her boot. So then you would actually have to go in and do load the girl as a selection and then come back up to your shadow layer and add it as a layer mask that's on the top and then invert the layer mask. All of that because you didn't bother to just fucking put the shadows in the right place to begin with, which is underneath the girl on top of the background. I've seen people do this so many times and it's just like, this can get really convoluted. You start getting into multiple figures and all of a sudden they've got shadows everywhere and all of them have to be masked. If you just put it underneath all your figures, you don't have to do any masking at all. Does that make sense? All right, so I'm going to throw my shadows away. I'm going to show you how to make a real shadow. It's the simplest way and it's really effective. So I'm going to click again on my tree layer, my background layer. I am going to add a blank layer on top of that. I'm going to double click on it and call it Shadow 1 and say OK to that. Then there's two keyboard shortcuts that we need to remember when we're doing shadows. One is the G key, it stands for gradient, and the other is the E key, it stands for erase. So we're going to set those up to begin with. So hit your G key, it will pick the gradient tool over in the middle of your toolbar. If you can't remember the G key, just go over and click on the gradient tool. It doesn't matter. It just makes it easier. When you're doing shadows, you build a lot of these relatively quickly, and you're just going back and forth between a couple of keys to do this, so it's easier. But at any rate, if you click on the gradient tool, you'll get a drop-out menu, and you'll see that it's not only the gradient tool, but it's the paint bucket tool and the 3D drop tool. It's all of those tools. You want to make sure that you've got the gradient tool. When you pick that, you will actually have options that deal with gradients. You need to go up to the options palette, click on the drop-down menu, and in the drop-down menu, I'm clicking now on the type of gradient that I want to build or that I want to use in this. So if you click on the drop-down menu, you'll come down. There'll be a set of ones in files. You want to open up the basic gradient panel. In the basic gradient panel, if you hover over the very first one, the first one is foreground to background. That's the gradient, so it's white to black because I've got mine defaulted to black and white. If you go to the next gradient over, it is foreground to transparency. And if you go to the next one over, it is just black to white. So no matter what your foreground and background colors are, that last one will always be black to white. The one we want to pick is the one in the middle. We want to actually go from foreground, which is black, to transparency. Now, if your foreground color is white right now, I don't know if you can hit the X key at this stage of the game. No, you can't hit the X key with this drop down like this. But if you go ahead and click that foreground to background, and then to get rid of this drop down menu, click right next to the word that says Adobe up at the top. It just gets rid of that drop down menu without impacting your image. If your foreground color was white, simply hit the X key. You will see that your preview up here will show you foreground to transparency. My color right now is white, so it's going white to transparency. I'm going to hit the X key again. You want to go to black to transparency. And then the last thing that you need to set up here on the very top is you have 5 different types of gradients. If you, I'm going to do you can just watch this right now. You don't need to do this. I'm going to go to a brand new screen right now, just a brand new image right here, just to show you what this actually looks like. That'll be okay. No, that won't be okay. Oh, yeah, that'll be okay. So in the gradients, I'm going to go to the G key again. The first gradient, I'm looking at these little 5 icons that are running across the top. The first gradient is a linear gradient. Actually, I'm going to also go to black and white so you can see everything in here. Otherwise, it won't make sense. So linear gradient goes from one to the other. So this is going to be black to white, just goes across. It's the gradient everybody normally uses. The second gradient over is a radial gradient. If I now click in the center and drag out, it gives me a circle that goes from, again, foreground to background. If I go to the third gradient over and click and drop this down, this is actually supposed to look like the inside or the outside of a cone. If I go to the fourth gradient over, this is actually a reflected gradient. So what you end up with, I'll do it a little bit lower down. What you end up with is that you go from background to foreground to background again. And then finally the last gradient, if you click on it, it's supposed to, if you imagine being inside a really tall rectangle box and looking up at the ceiling, that's supposed to be what this gradient looks like. It looks like a star to me. I don't really care. The one that you want to use though is the circular gradient. So we are going to do circle gradients. That's what we're going to work with on all of this. And then I'm going to change this back to a black to transparent. So this is what my gradient's ultimately going to look like. So I'm going to close this up. I don't need to save that. So everybody's got a black to transparent and then the radial gradient selected in the middle. Are we good on this part? And you've got a shadow layer that's sitting underneath your figure on top of your background, and it's called shadow 1. Everybody's got that too? Fine. Then you need to zoom in so that we're pretty close to her foot. I'm going to start with her right foot. And I'm simply going to click and drag a line down. And that puts on a radial gradient. And you can see it actually is very dark in the middle, and then it fades out to the sides. And again, I just did this to the side. You don't need to worry about where this is. We've got to transform this thing now. So this process that we do, gradient to transform to erase, happens over and over and over again. These are always going to be the 3 steps that you follow in doing this. So the first step is to build a gradient, radial gradient that goes from black to transparent. The next one is to transform this. Hit Command T, and you will see that when you do that, it brings up, you've got control handles on your gradient here. If you grab the top control handle and you bring it down, what you'll notice is that it starts to compress your gradient from the top down, but it doesn't do anything to the bottom of the gradient. That's not going to help us. We want to crush this gradient, but we want to do it from the top down and the bottom up. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. Instead, grab the top handle just like we did, but hold down your Option key. And now when you click and drag down, you'll notice that the top is coming down, but the bottom is also coming up. And you want to crush this thing down till it's flat like a pancake. Now we can also, this gradient is now too wide. Again, I'm building the shadow that's just going to go underneath the front of her foot. So I'm going to hold down, doesn't matter whether you grab the handle on the left or the one on the right, it doesn't make a bit of difference. You're going to click on the handle, hold down the Option key, and bring it towards the center as well. And we're just making this whole shadow smaller. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on here? All right. I'm not going to commit to transform yet. I'm actually going to put this thing in its place. So if you hover in the middle of your transform dialog box, one of the things you need to watch out for is if you get too close to the anchor point and you try to move, I want to move the whole gradient. I want to put the whole gradient underneath her foot. But if I get too close to the anchor point and I click and drag, what ends up happening is that it puts the anchor point underneath her foot and the gradient doesn't move. So make sure that you stay away from the anchor point, but you need to be inside the transform box. If you're outside the transform box and you click and drag, it will rotate your gradient, which is not what we want to do. So I'm in the center right here. I'm going to click and I'm simply going to drag this and bring it right up underneath her foot. And you can see as I get close to her foot, that it looks reasonably good here. I'm pretty happy with it. I still have gradients on both sides, but I'm going to fix those in my next step after this. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this transform by clicking on the check mark up at the very top. Then I'm going to move it. Again, the anchor point was hiding it for me from a little bit. So I'm going to hit the V key to actually move it. Sometimes it's hard to move this in the increments that you want. You'll see it wants to snap to things. So you can use your arrow keys, your up and down, left and right arrow keys to actually move this in smaller increments. And I'm just going to start bringing my arrow keys down so I get a little bit more of the shadow that's right underneath her foot. And I'm going to say OK to this. I'm fine with that. Then I'm going to hit the E key. Remember, I told you the E key and the G key. You go back and forth with these. When you get to the E key, when you hit it, you get the eraser tool. By default, I leave the eraser set to a brush, 100% opacity, and again, I change my flow down to like a 6 or 7% so that I can scrub this in slowly. Otherwise, you don't want this to hit really quickly. You want to be able to control it. What I need to do is eliminate the shadows that are on the sides of her feet, because again, the shadow is coming from her shoe only. There's nothing that explains the shadow that's on the left side of her boot and that's on the right side of her boot. If you turn your shadow on and off, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. There's nothing that's explaining the shadow on this side, so you need to get rid of it. You use the eraser tool to do it. So I'm just going to come scrub over here and I get rid of that side. I'm going to go on the other side and do the same trick, and I've gotten rid of that side over there. This is my first shadow. It's not going to be my last shadow. I need to do another one, but that I'll actually hit more on the side of this boot. So I'm creating a new background layer. I'm double clicking on it. I'm going to call it Shadow 2. Hit the G key to get the gradient tool. Click and pull out to get a gradient. Command T to do a transform. Option key to actually crush this front to back. Then move this underneath her boot again. There needs to be one that's a little bit higher up underneath her part. I've got the part that's supposed to be really underneath her toe. This is a little bit more further back into her boot. I've got it really wide now, but I'm going to fix that with the eraser tool. I'm going to click OK to that. Hit the E key to get the eraser tool and get rid of it on the side of her foot here and on the side of her foot here. And that is how you build the shadow for this first foot. Yes. Then you didn't make a separate layer for your second shadow. That's why you do separate. So go back in history. It's just easier to go back in history and undo it. So and go back there and then just create a second, just another blank layer. Sometimes, guys, you get into really complex shadows. You'll have 9, 10, 8, 7, 8 layers that are building up one shadow to go under a figure. Did this? Yes.
You just, like, for you do composite stuff, you just group it and be like, this is the right foot shadows, and then it expands and it's like 15 shadows for the right
Oh, yeah. And also you can use opacity in this. If you feel like your shadows are too strong, you use opacity to adjust them down. Because when we get into complex shadows next week, you'll see that we need to do multiple versions of it, because shadows, so they'll talk about it. There are different names for it, but the shadow that's immediately under her foot is going to be the darkest of all. But if we look at her other foot, you'll actually see there's a shadow that needs to go underneath the part of her shoe that is off the ground. So the part that's between the heel and her and the sole, the bottom of her shoe, the shadow in that area would be lighter than the shadow that is underneath her toe. So again, you would use opacity to control that to make it lighter. We're going to do it right now. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that and hopefully not lose my battery in my tablet. So I'm over on the left foot right now. I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to call it Shadow 3. And on this side over here, gradient tool, G key, click and pull out a gradient. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Option key to crush this flat. I'm going to make the shadow to go underneath her entire shoe. Now her shoe is at an angle, it's not flat. So I'm going to bring my cursor outside of my transform and I can rotate it around the angle right now so that it mirrors the angle that's running underneath her shoe before I bring this down and stick it underneath her shoe. That's now actually giving me the shadow that's running front to back on her shoe. I'm going to put in a little bit more angle on this and pull it down just a little bit more. You can still do your arrow keys actually here with the transform dialog box. You don't have to commit it. You can actually run them using while they're still while the transform hasn't been committed yet. So I've got this one is actually roughly in the place that I want it. I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark to that. Hit the E key to get my eraser tool immediately and kill anything that came out behind that heel, because it was actually on that leaf that was on the very back. That would never happen. And then a little bit on the front of her toe. I'm going to leave what's going on underneath her foot exactly where it is right now. I'm also going to drop the opacity of this a little bit. Again, this is like the shadow that I was just telling you about. It would be slightly lighter in this area that's between the back heel and her sole of her shoe. It'd be a little bit lighter because, again, there's light that's able to get into this area here, so it would lift those shadows a little bit. But the area that's right under her toe, not so. It's going to be darker. So I'm going to add another shadow layer, double click on it, call it shadow 4. And say OK. G key to get the gradient tool, click and drag it out, Command T to actually transform it, hold down the Option key and crush this. This is going to be the one that's right underneath her toe, so I'm going to bring it out a little bit. I'm also going to rotate it a little bit and drag this underneath the front part of her. So I'm really going more after that toe area. I'm going to keep the darker part of it underneath her toe. I'm going to lift it up a little bit. I'm going to go to my arrow keys because it wants to actually snap to it in the front. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. I've got a lot of shadow in the front now that I don't want. Hit the E key to actually go in and erase this part. I'm going to bring this down underneath her toe a little bit more and even kick it underneath her foot just a little bit more. And that's now my shadow for that. I'm going to double click on the hand, and then I'm going to group all of my shadows together. So I'm going to go to my layers palette. Shadow number 4 is already selected. I'm going to scroll down to shadow number 1, hold down the shift key and click on that. All 4 of my shadows are now selected. I'm going to go to the drop down menu just to for the layers palette. Again, the menu that's all the way to the right. Click on the drop down and do new group from layers. And in this I'm going to call it shadows. And say OK. And then you can turn this on and off, and you'll see exactly what I mean by anchoring this person into that space. Boom. Are we good on this part? OK. I'm going to skip ahead and do something else here really quickly just so that you can get all of the homework done. If you want to save this file, go ahead and save it. You can use it to go back and refer to, that kind of thing. Whether it's not your homework, you're not going to turn it in here, all of that kind of stuff. Your homework is to actually, I've given you figures to use. You are to go out and shoot a natural background or use a natural background that you've already shot or find one online. I don't care where you do, but you need to actually build a composite out of, you've got this figure and another figure that you can use, either one. If you look at your assignment folder, you'll see. We'll go and I'll show it to you really quickly. If you look in the assignment folder, you've got this composite body right here and this composite body. They're already knocked out for you. All you need to do is, like I say, shoot a background, find a background, use one of your old ones, find something online, whatever, and composite one of these figures into that background. Make sense? Okay. The last thing in here, though, that I do want to do with you, because if we can get this done, and I think we've got time to do it, we can actually then do the other half of your assignment, which is to generate a man-made background and do a composite using that. So, is everybody good on all the work that we've done up to this point? Are we good with this part? Okay, hopefully the build background will be easier. If you go to the build background assignment, it's also in your session number 9 folder right here. There's a folder in there called build background exercise. And there are 2 files that I want to start with. Again, you can save the work in your Photoshop if you want to. I'm going to close mine up. I'll go ahead and save it just in case we need to revisit it again next week. But going back to those 2 files, I want to start, there's 4 files in here. There's a background wall 2, glossy cement floor, and puppet warp. Does everybody have those? Okay, we're going to start with just the 2 walls. So background wall 1 and background wall 2. I want you to open both of those up into Photoshop. And again, they'll open up both of these. They're separate files in here. I'm going to start with the one of the peeling paint. you'll actually see if you look at the peeling paint layers, there's an adjustment layer on the top of that that actually bumps the contrast. You can bump the contrast, I'm fine with that. This is actually a picture that I took of a concrete overpass that holds up one of the trains, one of the metro trains. This is a photograph of a piece of the wall that's about the size of a book, like a paperback book. It's really small. That's all it is. And the one that's next to it, the other one, is the picture of a sample of wallpaper that I actually got at a wallpaper company. That's also, it's like an 8.5 by 11. It's really small. I just threw it on a flatbed scanner and scanned it. What I was hoping to do, the idea that I had behind all of this is that, you guys have been in buildings where it's like you have paint peeling off a building and there's wallpaper underneath it or something like that, or you'll see or paint that's peeling and there's an old color of paint underneath that, and that's beginning to show through. It was that sort of mixed, distressed area. That's what I wanted. That's the backgrounds that I wanted to actually do a whole body of work in. And I couldn't find the place, so I decided I was going to make the place, and so this is how I'm going to make it. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually grab the wallpaper and drag it on top of the background. Of the peeling paint. So when you go into the peeling paint, you need to make sure that you've selected the contrast layer. Because again, if I drag the wallpaper in and the background is actually selected, it will put the wallpaper underneath the curve, and so then when I turn the contrast curve on, the wallpaper gets contrast added to it as well, and I don't want that. I want it to be above it. So again, I'm selecting the curve, then I'm going to go back to my wallpaper version, and I'm going to simply click on the layer and drag it on top of my peeling paint, hold down the Shift key and let go, and it will bring it in centered into space. Then I can get rid of the original background wall 2 file because I've pulled them together. That's all I needed to do. Now, the wallpaper is not covering the entire background, and I want it to cover the background, so I'm not going to turn it into a smart object. I don't need to worry about that. I just need to make it bigger. So I'm going to hit Command-T to transform this. I'm going to click on the link between width and height, and I'm just going to use the scrubby slider to make it bigger so that it just covers my entire scene, and I'm going to say OK to that. I'm going to click on the check mark, and I'm actually done. So now, the way people will actually put these two things together, people try to use blending modes to do that. So for instance, with the wallpaper selected, if you click on your drop-down menu, blending mode, and you come down to overlay, what it'll do is it'll try to give you sort of a simulation about what's going on, but the truth of it is, I want the wallpaper to appear underneath the paint. And depending on what's going on here, it actually is laying on top of all of the paint. It blends the two together, but not in a convincing way, not in a way where I feel like, okay, this wallpaper is underneath the paint that's on the paint that's on the wall. You can try another blending mode. We can actually try multiply for this, but multiply screens it on top of everything, so that's not going to work for me either here. So it's not blending modes here. That's not going to do it. What will do it, though, is a layer mask. However, I can go in here and I can try. I'm going to turn off my wallpaper for a second. I can try to paint this layer mask, but that is, paint the wallpaper also. I'm looking at all the lines where you get the really sharp edges of lines. I could try to paint that by hand, but what a nightmare. I've already got the mask is already built into my image, though. So to do it, I'm going to leave my wallpaper layer turned off. I'm going to come into my channels palette right here, and I'm going to load the luminosity of the RGB channel. I'm simply going to hold down the Command key and click. It loads that as a selection. I've now just loaded the luminosity of this RGB guy, and I'm going to save it. So up to the Select menu, down to Save Selection, and I'm just going to call it Luminosity. And say OK. Command-D to deselect. If you go to the bottom of your layers palette, you can look at it, and it's basically just a black and white version of this image. However, I want the paint to be on top. Go to the very top of your channels palette, hover over the thumbnail of the RGB channel. Are you good? Hold down the Command key and click. We do this all the time. It's just loading this as a selection. Again, a selection and a mask, same thing. It's just the luminosity. Wherever it's light is being massively selected. Wherever it's dark is not being selected. Good? Save this as a selection, up to the select menu, down to save selection, and call it luminosity. And say OK. Command D to deselect. Now if I look at this and I want to use this as a layer mask, what's going to happen? All the areas that are white here are actually going to show the wallpaper. That's not what I want. I want all these areas that are the paint to hide the wallpaper. So I invert the mask. Command I. Now the areas that are darker are going to hide the wallpaper, and the areas that are lighter are going to show it. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm going to load this now as a selection. So hover over the thumbnail of luminosity, hold down the command key, and click. It loads it as a selection. And then I'm going to come over to my wallpaper layer. I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to add it as a layer mask. And now you can see areas that are really white in here are actually hiding the wallpaper. Areas that are darker are letting the wallpaper show through. However, the effect is not enough for me right now. I want the effect to be stronger. So what I need to do, if you hold down your Option key and click on the layer mask, what I need to do is all of these areas that are lighter in here, I need to make them even lighter still to show the wallpaper. The areas that are darker, that is the paint, I need them to be even darker still to hide the wallpaper. Does that make sense? Now again, you could try with a brush. So I'm going to do this blind. I'm just going to go in with a brush, the B key. White is my foreground color. I'm going to leave this as my opacity 100% flow, whatever. I'm going to change it. It's a soft brush, whatever. I can come into areas like that are lighter up in here, or that I want to be lighter. So again, it's like this is the background right here. But if I click and I paint on this, it doesn't respect those lines at all. All the work that I did to create that beautiful line, I just blew the hell out of it by painting on here. So instead, I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. I want to do something that respects the luminosity that already exists. What could I do? Say what? I could use levels, but I want to be more local about this. I want to paint. Overlay. Exactly. Overlay brush. Start to come in here, and it's actually respecting that part. It overlaps a little bit, not great, but it still respects that part, and it works out really well. Command Z to undo this. I can also dodge and burn. You've got a dodge and burn tool. So if we pick the dodge tool, it will come over here and you can actually control what areas you want. This is roughly a mid-tone in here, so I'm going to go to my drop-down menu and pick mid-tones. White is my foreground color, and I'm just going to dodge this out. And it respects those tones completely. If we watch it in real time, you can see I just brought that in. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. Command Option Z to undo all. Never mind. All right, so working on my layer mask with my dodge tool right here. I'm going to just run across this. It's letting in more of the wallpaper that's showing up. There's up here on the top, there's wallpaper that's on the paint. I want to hide that, so I'm going to go to my burn tool and actually run it across that. It gets rid of that part here. So you can sort of see what's actually happening in here. You were right about levels, though. I can run levels on this. Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. I can do this more wholesale. So I'm going to click on this. I'm pumping up my blacks that are allowing a little bit more of my wallpaper to show through. I'm going to clean up my whites a little bit more by pulling them back. I'm going to open up those blacks again a little bit more, and I'm going to say OK. And this is how I then create that space. Does that make sense to everyone? Questions about this? We're almost done. You can see what my mask looks like. It's considerably darker and lighter. Again, I can go in and adjust all these. I would actually undo this. I'm going to go back to my brush as an overlay and just lighten these up really quickly. And that part in there, I'm feeling good about that. Yahoo, looks great. I'm going to then go to my image, again, into my folder, the build background folder. There's a file in there called Puppet Warp Figure. If you can double click on that, it will actually open up. If you then take a look at this, I'm going to hide everybody else. I'm going to turn off the background. I'm going to turn off everything that's on this figure layer. The figure is just by itself. It's in a group. So I'm going to drag the entire group over onto this. So click on figure, drag it on top of the background, hold down the shift key and let go, and it brings it in. So now I've basically got the image that I'm looking for. I'm going to close up my figure. I don't need that anymore. I don't need to save it. But what's missing in this image? How about a floor? She's not in a space. She's in front of some wall, floating. I need a floor for this, right? It's the last of the images. It'll take 2 minutes to do this. Go back into your images, into that folder, build background, double click on concrete glossy cement. If you get a warning, don't worry about it, just say okay. This is actually a picture that I got from online. It's a picture of somebody looking straight down onto a concrete floor. We're going to turn this into a floor in the image. So to do this, go into your image. We need this to be on top of the background, but underneath the figure. So select the wallpaper layer, go back to your concrete glossy floor, click on the floor layer, drag it over to your composite image, hold down the shift key and let go. Say okay to the warnings. It'll bring in a square here right in the middle. This is going to be my floor, but right now it looks like a wall. Doesn't it? Are you guys still with me on this? It looks like a wall. I need to change it into a floor. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the concrete image. I don't need to keep that anymore. I've got everything I need all in this one frame. I need to change this into a smart object, my floor, because it's going to do a radical transform. Up to the layer image, down to smart objects, over to convert to smart object. We need to go to the pasteboard now because this is a radical transformation. So hit the F key once to get to the pasteboard. Then working on my layer right here, I am going to transform it. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. However, this is just going to scale it. I need to actually do a perspective transform. Come up to your edit menu, down to transform, over to perspective. So look at my image where I am at right now. All this is going to do is change the behavior of my handles. So I'm going to change it to perspective. Then I'm going to grab the top handle on the top right hand side and drag it to the right to make this image at least it needs to be wide enough to fill my entire image. But the perspective that I just added to that made a ceiling, or it's beginning to make a ceiling. That's okay. I'm going to then go to my one on the bottom, and I'm going to click on the one on the bottom and drag it, and I'm going to start going way out. Now, I can't see how far I need to go out, but I'm not far enough out. So I'm going to use my keyboard shortcuts to make my image smaller so that I can continue to drag that transform out. This is why we're on the pasteboard. And I've got a massive distortion in here, which is fine. I'm just going to go ahead and say OK to this. Click on the check mark. Double click on the hand to come back in, and you can see this is now a floor. It's in the wrong place. I need to hit the V key to move it, and now I'm going to simply drop it down, and this is how I'm going to hide all these other things that are showing around on this. This is how I actually make this into a floor. Now you'll see that it looks like there's a border around this thing. The reason you've got that border is there is a curve in here that's controlling something it's this one right here. I'm going to just turn that guy off. It's controlling something in the figure. The figure is not just by itself. So anyway, I've now got a floor. Depending on how high the floor goes in my image depends on how far away it is from the back wall. So if I bring it way down here, she's close to the back wall. If I bring it up, she's farther away from the back wall. So this is actually what I would do right here, and this is how you create a man-made background for your composite. And that is your second assignment for next week, is to generate a synthetic background and do a composite on it as well. Are there questions about this? Again, It needs shadows, you know, all the above. If you want to see shadows really quickly, I'll show you. If you got to go, I understand. I'm just going to add a blank layer up on top of this. Hit the G key to get my gradient tool. I'm still set up the same way I was. I'm going to drag it out to get a gradient. Command T to actually get my transform tool, pull it down, drag it down so it goes underneath her. The darker part of the shadow is going to be underneath her. I'm going to drag the other end out. The darker part would be way underneath her. Again, make this a little bit smaller. Say OK to that. And then radically drop my opacity on this because it would never be anywhere near that much. Again, go in, hit the E key to get an eraser tool, get rid of everything in the front. I've missed some of the side back here, but you guys get where this is going. And then you would build a second shadow to go right underneath her feet, which would be stronger, and you're off to the races. Are we good? You can build your background is pretty much open. So one's a real background, one's something that you've created. All right. I'll see you guys next week.
I can see this finger, but it's blank.
That's just a blank white background. Just turn it off.
Turn what off? This.
That. And then she's on transparent, which is what you want.
Where is it?
Go all the way to the top. She's the figure in the group. Move this group over. She's the figure.
I see.
So you're grabbing the whole group and dragging it over.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is this assignment homework, or do we do another one like this?
This is not your homework.
I made a heel, not a floor.
You did what?
I made a heel, not a floor. Like a heel, whatever. Like it's not a floor.
No, it is not a floor. So no, wait. But we can go back in. All you need to do is go back to convert to smart object. No, that's your transform. Right? So what you didn't do was what I did to start this background. So it is. So let me stop the recording really quick because nobody needs to listen to something they can't see.